Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Chicanery. Of course, it is your usual host. I am Danny, and we have JT,
Hello.
and we have a guest today. Say hello, Baraka.
Hello, how are you guys doing? My name is Baraka.
Yes, so we will. This, needless to say, we were talking about this a bit off mic. That this was kind of a big, I guess, call it 60 hours. We'll split the difference in Formula One. Amazing to think that effectively the second half of the week created one of the biggest news cycles that the sport has seen in probably a decade. So, well, first I guess we'll work in reverse chronological order. So we're going to start at the front in the biggest news. One, Sir Lewis Hamilton is going to Ferrari in 2025. Holy, that is absolute insanity.
Yeah, this one, waking up 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then your phone, ESPN, and Twitter starts popping off with this breaking news, and I was like, oh, it's probably typical silly season stuff. I didn't believe it until you had reputable F1 journalists saying, "He's like, yep, it's happening." We were just waiting for the confirmation from both Mercedes and Ferrari, and lo and behold, later that day we got the confirmation. And let's just say the F, foot, mind you, not that day when it was announced. If you watch soccer, it's we had the last day of the transfer window was happening. By far, January, from what I know, was the worst. Nothing really happened, and but then now with this one, even the football, you have Fabrizio Romano posting stuff about that, which was off. It's like that caught me off guard too. So let's just say that day was crazy.
Yeah, I guess honestly, when it first when I first heard about it, I honestly didn't really believe that it was actually true. I think it was like Will Buxton was like the first person to make a tweet about, oh, I heard like some news and um by the time it gets released by the end of the week or something, it would be like it's huge or whatever. And I'm like, okay, what are the odds that this is like some random person on F1 Twitter that happens to have like a bunch of followers, like they have like 10,000K followers or whatever, and they made up some random rumor. Because to be honest, the Ferrari, like Lewis to Ferrari, had been like a thing people were speculating for a while, and some of it's just because like they wanted him to be teammates with Charles. So I'm like, I thought it was made up, honestly, because there are a lot of people, again, in the F1 community that have big platforms and people trust them. Like, they'll like to lie about how they have insider information on things and people trust them and they just run with it. And then I'm like, okay, Sky Sports is reporting on it. So maybe there's some truth to it. However, Sky Sports was the same platform that said that Oscar Piastri was going to go to Alpine, and we all know how that turned out. So I honestly wasn't too sure that I could trust that it was legit. And I'm like, what is, again, maybe these were big platforms and journalists that got, duped by some random F1 Twitter fan that spread a rumor. Because I know I've seen another F1 journalist say something about, oh, they had big news of talking about they heard a rumor. And the last time that happened, they had to, bro had to issue like a statement like 2 days later. And it's probably because he got a cease and desist from whoever it was that he made up a rumor about. So I'm like, okay, I can believe it now once Mercedes and Ferrari came out and made official statements, and then F1 also officially made a statement. Like, okay, I can believe it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Same thing. I was out of town, so I went to bed and saw some of the little grumblings. And I was same thing. I was like, okay, well, we've been down this road before. Everybody, likes this hypothetical world where Charles and Lewis are teammates, and Lewis has actively said on a couple of occasions, it would be cool if. he drove for Ferrari at some point, but had up to that point made it pretty clear that he was probably going to finish out his career at Mercedes. And then same thing, I wake up and, Sky Sports is all over it. And I'm like, oh. And then for the main pod, we were in the middle of recording something else early in the afternoon. And then we wrap up and, breaking. First thing I see on Twitter, breaking. Um, Lewis is, leaving Mercedes, and then a statement from Ferrari. And it's like, this is real.
I mean, I want to say this might have happened because, I mean, Mercedes has lost like some good drivers up in these past months. Like they first on the sports car side, they lost Lalo and now Lewis Hamilton. And some people were saying that maybe this was because maybe for Lewis, it's because just the W13, W14 cars were not that great. And maybe the W15 isn't all that great either after he tested it or something. And then part of it also was because Mercedes, like the lack of Mercedes having a hypercar program, which a lot of other manufacturers in F1, Alpine, Ferrari, they have hypercars, and Mercedes is probably like one of the few ones that don't. Or at least one of the few like big heavyweight brands, manufacturers that don't. And I mean, I know probably part of the reason why at least Lalo might have left Mercedes because of that. I mean, I think he was also happened to be. This isn't a sports car episode, but I think some of the reason why he's at BMW now was he was in some of that like Audi withdrawing their like canceling all their like sports car stuff basically and scrapping their hypercar program, and he might have been like in the fallout of Audi's mass exodus of drivers that left them, because I know there are a lot of drivers that left because of that. So who knows? Maybe Lewis Hamilton will be at Le Mans at some point and one of Ferrari's hypercar entries.
Lewis Hamilton and for at Le Mans for racing for Ferrari would do numbers. I would definitely watch every minute of that race. Not because like as a fan because I already have my allegiances to Toyota. But even then, as a fan, I would love to just see people outside of like the sports car coming into Lamar. And to add on to the hypercar point, even Red Bull is developing a hypercar. Yeah, I think earlier this week Adrian Newey said that yeah, we're developing, things are going pretty well so far. So the fact that an energy drinks company is developing a hypercar before an actual car manufacturer, I think Lewis looked at that as like maybe that could be the case. And also I heard murmurs, I don't know if true, but Daimler themselves are questioning if they want to be heavily involved in F1 in the future. I think they've been having their doubts, especially among the board, if they want to continue investing in it. But time will tell, and probably Lewis had the heads up, given the fact that he wanted earlier today he wanted to be it was announced he wanted to be a brand ambassador for Daimler themselves for Mercedes Benz, but I think they just told them no. I say it wasn't in their plan. So a lot of factors behind the scenes that are now starting to come out into the light. With half is true, half could be just rumors made by some random F1 wannabe journal off of Twitter. We don't know, but there's where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, just one final thing is that Danny Ucadella, he drives a Corvette now. He was in Mercedes's driver pool before that. Um, so just another kind of funny one. But yeah, it's funny. There's lots of speculation. Of course, nothing has been concrete. Some folks are, going, wow, was the seat fitting, really that bad? That Lewis saw fit to dip. What is more accurate is that because I know they've done some simulator work with the new car over the winter, and it's distinctly possible that he saw something that he didn't like. But the one piece about this that I think that is absolutely fascinating is that there was a lot of will he, won't he, namely about retirement back late last summer before the contract extension was announced. And some of what is kind of bubbling to the surface is that part of the culprit for that was negotiating a release clause, which then, of course, before we've even hit preseason testing, he has then gone and activated to get the hell out of Dodge, which is fascinating to me if there's any amount of truth to that, because it's worth noting Lewis Hamilton is, I mean, Lewis is practically the point that he transcends F1 itself. So, the deal with Ferrari, that doesn't get done in a week. You don't hammer that out in 2 weeks. That will have been bubbling away for a while they negotiate the finer details. Um, so I find that curious, and then also the circumstances that led him to renew this contract in the first place, even given the fact that he was in theory simultaneously negotiating a contract with Ferrari. These are all things to kind of chew on, I guess. Like I said, I don't know if we'll ever truly know. I don't know. Maybe this will make, a fun, throwback podcast in 20 years after there have been, 3 books and a movie about it. But yeah, I do. I just, like I said, it's just some of the finer details, some of the unknowns that I think are kind of curious here.
Hello, hello. Editor Danny here. So, the morning after we recorded the episode that you're listening to, February 3rd, Lewis Hamilton would go out and release a statement at about 9 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, just sort of detailing some of his thoughts and feelings about leaving Mercedes. And I felt that was just too good to leave out of this episode, given that we spent basically the first, half hour, 40 minutes just talking about it. He goes on to say that after an incredible 11 years at Mercedes, the time has come for me to start a new chapter in my life, and I will be joining Ferrari in 2025. I feel incredibly fortunate after achieving things with Mercedes that I could have only dreamed of as a kid, that I now have the chance to fulfill another childhood dream, driving in Ferrari Red. And Lewis went through great lengths to stress just how difficult it was to leave the company that he's been associated with since his karting days, when McLaren and Ron Dennis, initially backed him in 2000. Mercedes has been a huge part of my life since I was 13 years old. So this is the hardest decision I've ever had to make. And I think that really does speak to probably how much he agonized over this decision to leave. And now this statement, this was probably a 1,500-word statement, so I am by no means going to sit here and read this all verbatim. However, it's easy enough to find. I'm sure you've probably read it already by the time this episode goes live. But I did want to throw this in here just as a kind of final point to put on the Lewis to Ferrari saga for now. But at any rate, thank you very much for tolerating Editor Danny in a slightly substandard audio situation here. And back to the episode. Enjoy.
Yeah, I think there's stuff that a lot of fans, even non-Lewis fans, are like wondering, because again, this is such a shock. When you think of Lewis, you think of Mercedes. Like, he's been Mercedes since like day one, pretty much. He's been racing Mercedes even at McLaren. He was racing a Mercedes engine, so pretty much that tri-star was synonymous with Lewis. And seeing him with a prancing horse on his race suit next season in 2025 will be something to get used to for me. Um, it's almost like when Schumacher came back to F1 and raced for Mercedes. It's like you sat there, it's like, it's cool, but something just doesn't fit right with that. As much as you love Schumacher, and he's back racing, it just, something wasn't clicking, and it's gonna take a while for me to get used to him wearing a red race suit for a year, for the next coming seasons. However he has left in his contract with Ferrari.
Yeah, like I said, from what I understand, they said it was a multi-year contract. We're not sure quite how long that runs until. That could just be 2025 and 2026. That could be through, maybe there's an option for 27. We don't know, but yeah, it's curious. But the timing of certainly the move is interesting. Fred Vasseur, since he took over as team principal at Ferrari, has been exceedingly vocal that he sees particularly 2025 and even 2026. Of course, that's the new power unit regulations, what have you, is pivotal years for Ferrari if it wants to get back to title contention. I think he's even dubbed them sort of reboot years, if you will. Um, and so he's really adamant about trying to lay the foundation to sort of get back to, basically Ferrari get back to true title contention, not as opposed to, last year where they kind of stumbled into it because the car was faster than they thought. Um, and so, a great example, the first person who was hired was like Sarah, who's head of vehicle performance at or AMG, or at least I guess was. He'll be starting in 2025, and of course you have Lewis coming over, and Fred and Horner actually got into a little bit of a tiff, basically kind of arguing over sort of staff that are on a gardening leave over the summer, because well, I guess what's now Visa, Cash App, FTX, RB, whatever. I know they wanted some ex Alpine and Ferrari talent, and Ferrari didn't really want them to, and so there was a little bit of squabbling about that. But yeah, so it's curious to watch as Fred is making big moves and is clearly very, very serious about making Ferrari a true title contender, particularly with this next set of regulations. So I just like I said, the timing of all of this is wild. And then it's actually worth noting that Lewis and Fred actually go way, way, way back when Lewis was in junior formula. Fred was his team principal when he was at ASM in F3 and Art GP in well, GP2, F2 now. Yeah, Fred was his boss. So I would have loved to have been the fly on the wall for whatever conversation that they had that has led to this. But much like how Fred and Charles actually go quite a ways back, clearly there was a bit of leaning on sort of a past established relationship. In the case of Charles, it was to get him to stay because rumor mill was intensifying that he was going to leave Ferrari. And then, whatever it was enough to get Lewis to come on because, why here the contract is valued at somewhere around $200 million. At this point, I doubt that's the reason why Lewis joined. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm sure the money is nice, but Lewis is, still very, very competitively driven. And so I don't think he would have jumped just for money, especially given that we watched the way both Fernando and Seb's times at Ferrari have they went poorly and well, if I'm being perfectly honest, kind of tainted their legacies a little bit.
Yeah, especially for with Alonso, I feel like that was um a recipe for disaster from the jump. I feel like it was at the time in which I never at the time for Ferrari were losing what the kids call it aura. That's what the kids these days call aura. Is like they were starting to lose their aura. When they unveiled the cars, you could tell like Fernando was just massive. Actually, I think Massa was there too. Memory serves me right, and they didn't look confident during their car presentation. And you know, yeah, he got that odd win in Valencia and that tractor, but still, it was a rough one. And I know with Seb, started off pretty well and then just ended in a train wreck. So there's a history with Ferrari when it comes to them signing like world champions and ending in disaster. Off to a flying start. Yeah, they probably in a title fight, but then fall off towards the end. But hopefully Lewis could buck the trend. And again, in terms of contracts, Lewis wouldn't agree with the Ferrari contract unless there were certain conditions met. He's heavily involved with Mission 44, and I couldn't see him accepting that Ferrari deal if Ferrari in turn wouldn't accept him involving, diversity and inclusion within the team. So, and given the fact that Fred Vasseur there, I think was enough to convince Lewis to, to trust him and, ride the wave going into 25, 26.
There was somebody that said something on Twitter where they were like, "Oh, I don't really see how Lewis is gonna like gel with like Ferrari. Like he kind of doesn't, represent their brand, I guess, and that he'll be like Ferrari's downfall." And I'm like, racial undertones aside, because they really didn't elaborate on what they meant by saying that, by that he wouldn't really gel with the team, doesn't really, represent Ferrari as a brand, which I can already guess that's probably what they meant is because he's black. Let's just be for real. But I'm like, come on now. Lewis can't possibly fuck up any more than Ferrari fucks up themselves. Like most of their fuck ups come from because they do something wrong. Like it's like internal issues. Very few of times that Ferrari does something wrong, fumbles a race, whatever. It's always been an internal issue. It's rarely ever been any sort of external factors that have played into it. So I don't really see like Lewis is not going to be their downfall. If anything, their downfall will be again because they fail spectacularly and screw up something.
Yeah, I suspect you're absolutely right, and it's just worth noting. Certainly, I've talked about this ad nauseum, but certainly for any new viewers or listeners, as it were, we don't have a video component yet, and hopefully we never will. But um, I come from particularly, I have a background in, road car development. Worked for a few large OEs, and it's funny versus that time and now to kind of watch, frankly, kind of the shift in Ferrari demographics. I would earnestly say while they're in kind of an interesting crossroads right now, where you still have some of the old stoicism, and that's if I'm being polite, because really that's code for exceptionally stodgy and very irritating um, buyer demographic, but also it's trending actually a bit younger. So we're getting to a point where we're actually veering more towards, quotes, Hamilton's culture, if you will, than sort of what Ferrari has long since been associated with. It's like I said, it's an interesting shift, but yeah, but more to your point, yes, it's yeah, Ferrari is 99.999% of their issues have just been, yes, they have just been a hot mess. Um, much, to like Baraka said, they've, signed, ex world champions, a number of them over the last 15 years in that, number one spot. Um, just to come up completely empty handed. I have always said, and this is not an unpopular opinion, but for as storied as Ferrari is as a brand within, motorsports and Formula One particularly, Ferrari is also, frankly, a brand of underachievement. Ferrari is kind of the poster child for that. And that's not really ever been the fault of the drivers. So I would be amazed if that started now, but I doubt that that'll actually be the case.
Yeah, and I just looked up. I don't want to sound so conspiratorial and all that, but the last time a driver that race for Ferrari won a drivers' championship, the nationality of the team principal was French. Now, I'm not going to, say because I don't want to feed into it, but where I'm looking at Fred Vasseur's passport, it's a bit of a baguette, we smoking cigarette type thing. There's an Eiffel Tower in the background somewhere. So I'm just saying there could be a chance in which if Lewis does come in to Ferrari and Ferrari, fingers crossed, get their ish together in terms of car development, engineering, and all that, we could see a 8-time world champion wearing a red suit. And just think of the headlines. I know this year Mercedes will want to have that honor of dethroning Schumacher's record and have Lewis's record be stand on its own alone with eight world champions. How likely that will be, we'll see in preseason testing in a few weeks, but I'm not really confident given the fact how last year ended. Yes, they ended strongly, but given the fact where McLaren is and other they could give a run for the money if they landed the regs right for this year. But winning your eighth constructors in a Ferrari, beating a Ferrari legend would put you in the history books for Ferrari and I think all of Italy and motorsport fans in Italy, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, I would be absolutely insufferable if Lewis won an eighth title. And if he did it in red. I've always, certainly enjoyed the romanticism of the Ferrari brand in Formula One. They're bright red. They've been around since the very, very beginning. And certainly when you're a little kid getting into Formula One, that's really all it takes, truth be told. Never mind the fact that, of those years, more than half of them have been pockmarked with them doing an absolutely atrocious job, but you don't care about that when you're 7. So
Yeah.
it's
What
fine.
what was the quote that Seb said? Everyone, no matter who you're a fan of, what team you're driver, you're still a Ferrari fan.
Yeah, basically.
Everyone's a Ferrari fan.
Yeah.
So
And also it would be super cool for Lewis to win that many championships and do it with 3 different constructors, McLaren, Mercedes, and Ferrari. Um
yeah, I think yeah, no one else has won a drivers championship with three different constructors if I'm mistaken, right? In
granted
like
I
recent history.
Yeah, certainly not recently. I don't know. There might have been some weird mess going on in, my 1953 or something that I am failing to consider, but certainly in the last 30 years, the no.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Um, but of course,
The story is there for Lewis to win his eighth at Ferrari. The story, I can see it right now.
hmm yes, and of course I will look this up and I'll insert an edit note if that turns out to be incorrect. But yeah, no, like I said, just a wild way to kick off. Like we haven't even hit, it's funny, talk about silly season was, well, very not silly for basically the entirety of the year. There were no movements on the grid, no nothing. And then we get to a cup basically within, a month, a little less than a preseason testing, and boom, here we are. So, I'll be interested to see what dominoes start to fall as a result of this development. Who goes where, sorry. Because basically almost everybody short of Lewis, Charles, and Lando are going to be in a contract year for 2025. So I have a feeling that the game of musical chairs on the grid is going to get very, very silly as a direct result of this, and we might even see some announcements made as the season progresses, as folks ink deals potentially.
It'll be like IndyCar's silly season for like this year, last year, probably what F1 silly season for 2025 will be like.
Yeah, and I was gonna say like you could start to see the dominoes slowly like starting to tip over. I don't know if you guys heard. I think a few hours ago, there was reports that Red Bull is offering Albon a 3-year deal. Yeah, so it's like the dominoes are starting to tip over just a bit, and you have I say that Lando's on a death row contract with McLaren, so is Charles at Ferrari, and I could bet you top dollar that Christian Horner would do everything in his best to keep Max in that seat and not let him fly anywhere else.
The only
Because
thing Max would do, honestly, is probably I see him just leaving F1 altogether and then goes to like sports car racing or something, which God forbid that ever happens. But that's probably what he would do because honestly, all the complaints that I hear from him all the time is that like he's like bored. So if anything, he'll just do that because Formula One is too boring for him instead of
yeah,
just hopping to another team.
well, his dad did legit beat the whole F1 only route in his head since birth. So I'm not surprised he's getting burnt out now and getting sick of it. But if he goes to sports car again, New got a hypercar thing going on with Red Bull, so he may just transition over and have someone else. But I know for a fact that Horner will do his best to at least try to convince him enough to at least stay a little bit longer going into 2026.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll see what happens, but yeah, I do. I think it's going to get very, we call it silly season, certainly, with IndyCar, I might have to come up with a new term because it was, well, just dumb this year, quite frankly. And it may be, I think, of a similar caliber as we plot our way through the 2024 season as everybody figures out contracts. But yeah, like I said, what a absolute bombshell to effectively start the season on. Um, just maniac. But, the whole purpose, we'll get to the real reason why it started writing all of this down. And that was because I wanted to have a chat about Formula One or FOM specifically telling Andretti to take their money and their GM partnership and to go jump off the nearest bridge. It's really not super surprising. F1 and the teams have been ultra resistive to the idea of a 11th team. So, if you had been paying even the slightest bit of attention over the last, about 6 months or so, you probably would have seen this coming. But I still do think it is interesting nonetheless. Um, so, I have a copy in here of the statement that Formula One media issued around the
Don't tell me
time.
you're reading all of this because this is just nonsense.
I was just about to.
It's just fluff.
Yeah, I'm not going to read all of this verbatim. And, for anybody who's listening, it's really not that hard to find. You can find about a dozen outlets that just copy pasted it verbatim onto their articles about this. So you can go find this. But there are some bits and pieces that I do find curious and that I do specifically want to discuss. But I guess for anybody who has been asleep for the last 18 months, I do want to, or actually it's been longer than that, truth be told, do want to kind of just walk through kind of how we got here. And we're going to kind of speed run this a little bit because I could spend 2 hours on this by itself. But, I think it was back in like 2021, Michael Andretti had expressed some interest in, fielding an F1 entry. Um, particularly at the inaugural Miami Grand Prix, as well as at COTA for several years. You could see him walking up and down the paddock, talking to Stefano Domenicali, talking with the other team bosses. And like I say, expressing real interest. He was very public about, I want an F1 team through, it was, the Andretti Autosports brand at the time. Of course, that's Andretti Global now, but very serious about it. And then, in 2022 and 2023, there was some chatter that, he was looking to buy out. He tried to buy out an existing team. That was a statement that he had put out, and that the process was proving to be very, very difficult. To which FOM really didn't like that and basically told him to shut up and work through the correct avenues for this and stop chatting so much. Which, to his credit, he did. But that was kind of all we heard. However, last October, the FIA had basically put out a formal statement saying they had sifted through some expression of interest requests from a number of basically wannabe entrants. And the only one that met its criteria for sort of an ergo satisfied sort of technical capabilities was Andretti. And they felt that that was enough to justify the entry. But of course, the issue here being the Concord Agreement, as it is, pardon me, written and sort of currently enshrined, is that Formula One media and the teams, though to a lesser extent, have to agree, basically, that they can be let on the grid. Which, as it is, and I will talk about this a bit later, as it is, I think that's complete nonsense. It's like, okay, the sanctioning body says Gucci, so let's go. Having to sit here and work through the inter-team politics is very, very stupid. But that was pretty much where it let stand in, as of October last year. So then yes, we have arrived here. But much to as JT alluded to, the reasons for this, if you read through it, are not only very dumb but very repetitive. Clearly, they were grasping at straws for why they couldn't be, why they weren't allowing Andretti to be on the grid. Because something like it was, so I think it was like a 20-point statement. Um,
I just know like one of the reasons was they were basically questioning how exactly competitive Andretti, like how capable Andretti could be, basically when they got into F1. And it's like, listen, if we're gonna enter or allow teams to enter Formula One solely based off of how competitive you think they're going to be, then why do we have Haas on the grid? Like, to me, that's just so unserious. That is the world's most unserious thing, to sit there and be like, well, we're gonna deny you entry because we don't think that you'll be able to actually bring any sort of value to F1, which is like, that's a whole nother discussion in itself, questioning whether or not Andretti, of all names, is going to bring value to Formula One. And B, because we are questioning whether or not you're actually even going to be competitive and run up front, or if you're just going to, be waffling around at the back race after race, which is like Haas does that all the time. They do that. They've literally done that, just that, for like the past, like, probably more than 2 or 3 seasons. And part of it's because they don't feel like actually developing their car. They don't want to put any sort of effort or resources into developing their car so they actually can be competitive. And it's like, you might as well just let Andretti buy out Haas, because they actually would have bothered putting in resources to actually be competitive, unlike Gene Haas, who's like, yeah, fuck it. We don't really feel like putting in any sort of effort or resources, or we don't, see it beneficial to, do that, bother developing our car anymore. And it's like, you let Haas waft around and sit at the back of the grid every weekend, but then you're questioning Andretti. Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And then on the topic of Haas, the new team principal today, actually, you couldn't have scripted this any better. He clearly stated, it's like, yeah, in Bahrain, we're going to probably be in the back of the grid. It's like, if you couldn't script this any better. But like looking back on like the whole reasons why FOM didn't accept their bid, it's when you look at it, it's like, again, they were grasping at straws. Asking them to questioning their competitiveness is like, everyone. You don't have to be a motorsport guru to know. It's like, you probably won't be as competitive as you think your first go around into a new era. It's very, very rare where you see teams or drivers do that, and there's like one in a million type things. And so expecting that from Andretti is like, okay, even Dominicali should have known that, given that he was a team principal and he knows the ins and outs. It's like, yes, there's a process in trying to develop a car, develop an engine, develop, a lot of things. And just to say, it's like, oh, if we accept you in, you won't be competitive. You're going to be back of the grid most times. It's like, okay, that's kind of weird. But I think the one thing that really bothered me the most is when they acknowledge, it's like, and as much as Andretti is a big name in F1, they feel like they're gonna gain more being in F1 than F1 having them. And I felt like that was a big slap in the face to Mario. Say what you want about how his social views are. He is a world champion. From last time I remember, he's the only American world champion in F1 that I know of. That could be. I think there was another one way back, if I can remember. Yeah, before Mario, but Mario was the more well known one. I felt like that was a big slap in the face and kind of rude from F1 to say that to a legend of the game. It actually did bother me a bit all day when the news came out, because their reasons, I would say, had any validity to it.
I mean, it didn't. I mean, most of it I felt like probably was just because, what their own opinions, like, that's what they felt. And honestly, I mean, the whole situation, honestly, like, to be honest, I'm like, I sound like I'm really angry about it. I just think it's stupid. The whole thing was stupid just from the jump, because you even had from the beginning, it was so many F1 teams and F1 team principals railing against the idea of having another team, having one more team on the grid, so much so where they were also grasping for straws as well, for reasoning for why they shouldn't allow an 11th team on the grid, going so far as to say, well, if we add one more team, the racetrack is going to be too crowded and people are going to, crash into each other. Never mind the fact that plenty of other racing series race on the same exact circuits that F1 does and have even bigger cars than F1 cars and have even more entries, rather. And they don't really have an issue with people running into each other that much, other than just, plain simple racing incidents, of course. So it's like, I mean, I don't get it. I mean, the FOM, Formula One management, just seems to be a bunch of morons that enjoy hearing themselves talk, and it's just a giant circle jerk.
Yeah, and I'd say FOM, when you think about it, they serve the best interests of the teams. So whatever the teams put out, FOM will say, okay, we'll write this and we'll agree with that. And it's very frustrating because you have a lot of team principals that say it's like they even tell them to the face, as much as like, yeah, Andretti would be cool. They know it's like we're gonna lose the slice of our pie. And it's pretty much every team principal says like, as much as we respect the name Andretti, we don't respect it enough to lose money. We are not gonna give you a share of our pie to you. And it's just they got the rough end of the stick. And again, reasons given, complete BS in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. It's so weird for something that on the face of it seems so cut and dry and very stupid. It's exceedingly multifaceted. Um, because the big thing, and it was also actually, and I guess before I go any further, reading through this, because I read through this stupid statement probably 50,000 times when I was writing the outline for this, so I am more intimately familiar than I had really any interest in being, if I'm being perfectly honest. And a big thing was there were a few things that stuck out to me. One was yes, the big thing around, the ostensible, lack of heritage around Andretti. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely a symbiotic relationship. Andretti would absolutely gain some recognition from brand recognition and ergo growth from being an F1, but I'm like, it's a two-way street, because you all would pick up, particularly in the North American market, America, you would pick up some of that too. And it seems like such an easy thing to understand. And, and then you want to, talk about, value in things when, yes, you've got bottom feeders like Haas, the Red Bull junior team. And if I'm being brutally honest, Sauber and Williams. You want to talk about,
I don't Sauber anymore. It's like they're gonna let Andretti in once they have like 5 brands attached to their like team names and be like Royal Caribbean, Venmo, Ritz Carlton, Auto Nation, Andretti F1 team. That's what they want. That's what they meant by value. It had probably nothing to do with the Andretti name, and more so it's like, hey, are you gonna be able to bring in like 50 more new sponsors? Never mind the fact that McLaren has a whole CVS receipt list of sponsors, and you have bullshit team names like Cash App Racing Bulls or whatever, and the fucking whatever the fuck Sauber is supposed to be.
I think they're called Kick.
Cash Out, like
Steak Kick.
What even is that?
Sauber, which I think they actually got rid of the whole Sauber part at this point. It's very odd, in all honesty.
Yeah, yeah, Sauber, I mean, he's always sold the naming rights to that team. It'll still be, the blah 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 C number chassis thing. But yes, so like, Alfa Romeo and all of the different things when it was, ironically enough, way back when Red Bull was on the Sauber, um, back in the 90s. So no, that's not unusual. But yes, the fact that it's stake, but because stake is, gambling. So in some places that's illegal. So that's when they have the kick. And for those things, it's like, how on earth?
Kick is not any better. Like, this is not like it's supposed to be a like dig at the sponsor, but Kick honestly fucking sucks. Like, they're like the bottom of the barrel, like basically just trashy version of Twitch. Because they allow like homophobes, racists, transphobes, all like the people like Aiden Ross. That's who streams. That's why he's over there all the time, because he gets
got banned.
all the shit that he does is too much for Twitch, and he gets banned constantly. So he just moved over to Kick.
Yeah, so it's
Surely they'll have his name on the car at some point during all of this.
God, that would be so funny. But yeah, so you talk about value, and yes, you're absolutely right. That's what they're talking about. It's just, yes, like you said, it's a store receipt's worth of sponsors to tack onto the name. And like, don't get me wrong, that's in and of itself is not exactly a new thing. Scuderia, Ferrari, Marlboro during the Schumacher years. So we've seen something like this before, but it's this increasing commoditization, I guess, for want of a better phrase, that I find curious. And truth be told, actually slightly off-putting. But yeah, it's wild. And then the other thing is, and it's the very last part of this statement, and this is what really got me. And I will read this part verbatim because I want all of you to soak it in. By the way, a quick detour. Our fourth person here just slid in. They were running a little bit behind, but we can certainly make room for them. Say hello.
Hey, it's Caleb Carter, and I guess if you haven't had an introduction to me, I am someone very interested in motorsports. I've been in it for a while, and now currently working with Alpha Prime Xfinity, the Xfinity team, as a creative assistant, and also doing some other stuff on the side with them. So glad to meet you all.
Yes, hello. But yes, so I want to read this for you. So this is point 20. This is under the final, though, the second, or actually, I'm sorry, it's the third subheading under the conclusions of commercial assessment. So, quote, we would look differently on an application for entry of a team into the 2028 championship with the GM power unit, either as a GM works team or GM customer team, designing all allowable components in-house. In this case, there will be additional factors to consider in respect to the value that the applicant would bring to the championship, in particular in respect of bringing a prestigious new OEM to the sport as a power unit supplier.
That makes no sense. That makes no sense. Like, what are you? They're essentially saying they don't they put no value towards GM, General Motors, like one of the biggest like brands ever.
So
like, what?
Right track, wrong verse. They do value GM. What they don't give a shit about Andretti. That's what they're saying. They want GM. They want GM's money. But Michael Andretti, again, he can go find the nearest bridge and go jump off of it. They don't care about him or Mario or Andretti Global as an entity, but they want GM's money and backing in the sport. So they effectively want a full, factory, if we're going to continue to use now the brand here, they basically will want a full factory Cadillac team. No Andretti Cadillac, everything designed in-house. Now, certainly earlier in the statement, if you read a little bit up, the brief acceptance of a customer power unit is what they are, is what particularly FOM took real umbrage with, because of course it's going to take time to get those facilities online. So there was basically going to be potentially a year of stopgap where it was going to be a Renault unit, or I guess Alpine. I don't remember if they still badge them as Renaults, even though it's Alpine in the sport, but that's completely besides the point.
They badge them as Renaults.
Okay, they still badge them as Renaults. Yeah, I was just going to say Team Enstone to make my life easy, but yeah, so that is what they were going to end up doing. and yeah, FOM doesn't like that at all.
I was gonna
Um,
say, in my opinion, that's really kind of sad to just devalue the name of Andretti only to go for GM and their money just because. I mean, I get it that GM is a new OEM or having GM come in as a new OEM, that's going to bring a lot of money in. That's going to bring a lot of eyes to the sport also. It's going to bring a lot more Americans in just as much as having Andretti would. But I think trying to detach that from the Andretti name is what's going to also make it a lot worse. Because let's be honest, you don't want to see some random team come in and be like, oh, we're going to use GM power units. You want to see a team that you're already well known with, well versed with, and see them come in, like an American team such as, let's say, well, Andretti, maybe Dale Coyne, something like that, and they're spending their money. I know Dale Coyne sounds like a really interesting idea, or unlikely, but I think it's the fact that having GM come in, you want an American name to be attached with that. That's how you're going to get the maximum, I guess, money, the maximum value out of it.
I mean, see, this is my issue with F1 also. Is that they are putting in a lot of like resources and energy towards trying to court American fans and the American fan base and trying to get, more American fans to, watch the races. I mean, they have a fuck ton of, GPs in America, in the US, now instead of just having COTA, it's also the Miami Grand Prix and now the Las Vegas Grand Prix. And who knows, they might add more at some point. And it's like, I don't get how I don't what's the plan here? I personally just don't see what their plan is because I'm like you're trying to court the American F1 fan base, but at the same time it's like you deny Andretti an entry, which it's like, to be honest, having Andretti on the grid is more memorable, or people be able to, like, I don't know, attach to them more so than like Haas. So it's like Haas is an American team, but like there should at least like Andretti. It's like, yeah, people could probably, you know, they would have a reason to like connect with the sport a little bit more. I mean, honestly, like to me, I feel like it's kind of like a flop, in my opinion. Like the whole thing with F1 trying to get more American fans on board is like, I mean, it's a fad, I would say, and eventually it will slowly trail off.
I
Yeah, and I know for a fact what I think. This past afternoon, Andretti even released a statement wanting to tackle 2 points, and I have it on my phone like right here. They say I'll probably read the first point, but it says when Andretti Cadillac entered the FIA expression of interest process almost a year ago, the preferred first year of participation was indicated as 2025. The FIA approved our application with no specific limitation on whether the entry was for 2025 or 2026. Andretti Cadillac has been operating with 2026 as the year of entry for so many months now. The technicality of 2025 is still being part of the application is a result of the length of this process. Second point was we are not aware that the offer of a meeting had been extended and that would not be declined of a meeting with Formula One management. An in-person discussion, an in-person meeting to discuss commercial matters would be and remain of paramount importance to Andretti Cadillac. We welcome the opportunity to meet with Formula One management and to have written to them confirming our interests. Our work continues at pace. So pretty much Andretti is like, we're still going to operate like we're joining 2026, but this was a setback for sure for them.
and yeah, I could easily see how to get told that when you've been put this much work in already, being prepared, getting basically everything up and running to where you'll be entering at 2026 just for you to get, your application to come back and say, "Hey, we didn't actually like accept this." Then it's just a really, really odd situation where you're putting these resources in, and you had already been told that, hey, you'll be allowed in, just for them to really go back on that decision and have to figure out what you're going to do with the resources and with the partnership that you have made with Andretti is kind of just a really, really bad, I guess, best way to put it, a really, really bad situation to be put in. Like,
Yeah, it also highlights the disconnect between FOM and the FIA, because the FIA granted them after they've done their process, like, okay, yeah, you could join, and then FOM is like, whoa, hold up there, who invited you to the party? And it was like,
exactly.
okay, there's a big disconnect. Then I think this situation pretty much put a big emphasis of, yeah, they like they can't agree on anything.
Yeah, and that's excuse me. And that's kind of been the issue, particularly since the kind of the last, frankly, I guess we can roll back to probably the last 3 or 4 Concord agreements. That has been the problem. There has been a growing level of both discontentment and disconnect between the teams and the commercial side, and then the FIA itself. Say what you will about, the Max and Bernie era of F1, and there's plenty to be said for, in some ways, how Byzantine that operation was. However, they were both smart enough to A, understand the value of working together to get this stuff done, and B, to understand that, frankly, that the teams can absolutely not be trusted to wield the amount of power that they do now. And that they did basically everything in their power effectively to not. And it annoyed the teams because, certainly if you wind back the clock to several times, and particularly the early 2000s during the first big manufacturers era, there were plenty of threats of effectively a breakaway championship. But it never really came to anything. But then you see this stuff now, and you see particularly FOM and what it does, and how, in the long run, likely how damaging to the sport that this decision is going to be, the precedent that sets. Because there are a number of things. So like I said, because I've read through the statement, and I could sit here and genuinely, I could go all night picking apart some of the intricacies of this statement. They talk about the strain put on, the race venues, and track, race organizers, race promoters. It's like, you guys didn't figure that out already. That and this is, and mind you, this is, I am operating and taking their statement in good faith. I think that statement is complete and utter BS, frankly. But assuming that is true, how did nobody realize that before now? That an 11th team would be too much operational strain. Why did we greenlight this if that was the case? But then from the team's perspective, talking about sharing of the prize money, it's like, well, there's like a $600 million anti-dilution fund, so that's thing number one. It's like, so that will just about make up for the cut in the split of the commercial revenue. But also, if frankly FOM does its job, then an 11th team, an American team, the amount of market share that F1 would pick up in the United States would more than make up for that. Andre Harrison at Motorsports 101 talked about it, and the analogy he used, which I thought was perfect, was the teams want basically 10 slices of a medium pizza as opposed to 11 slices of a large. It's basically what we're seeing. And additionally, it's funny, yes, because JT, you talked at length about sort of the kind of, frankly, kind of ass backwards way of that F1 has been kind of trying to court the American market, but it's become increasingly clear, and actually Road and Tracks, a motorsports editor, Fred Smith, he's tweeted this at length a number of times. Formula One as an organization is certainly more in love with the idea, and particularly their idea of Americans and an American team, than actually having a true American team. Everybody likes to talk about, Haas is the American team. I mean, yes, technically they do have an office in Charlotte that doesn't hardly get used. The vast majority of the engineering and the design work, happens in Banbury. And then, of course, they've got a facility in Maranello because they basically pull as many parts as the regulations allow wholesale from Ferrari. So they've got a big facility and actually just outside Maranello. It's not really an American team now, is it? You
Not at all.
know, yeah, it's like, and then, Williams likes to, be very goofy now that they've got Logan Sargent on the grid. And, don't get me wrong. Yes, what is a kilometer, blah, blah, blah. But, that's one driver out of 20. It's like, and it's a brand, that is, very team, that is very, very quintessentially English, Enzo rather famously called teams like Williams, the garagistas, when those were starting to spring up. Um, so it's like, like I said, everybody likes the idea because, it allows Williams to do, silly PR things with Logan every time that there's a race in the United States, and then F1 can kind of pretend, when they come to the US, from Miami, Vegas, and Coda, oh, look, Haas is at home. That's
Yeah,
like, no, not really.
it's like the issue with it for me is the fact that they put so much effort into, I guess, what they have currently without bringing in a new team. And I feel like that's going to really, in all reality, that's going to act against them because the fact of the matter is you're having a team that has very well showed its interest, that has a good amount of backing, a good, like a whole new OEM that they want to take with them. And yet, and obviously, like Baraka said, you can see that disconnect between FIA and FOM and how both sides just didn't have enough communication on that. Had that communication been established, I don't think any of the situation would have happened in the first place. But the fact that none of that was established, here we are with this situation, and they're trying to figure out, okay, so was he allowed in, or was the team allowed in, or were they not? And I feel like had this all been figured out, first of all, that would have been good. Secondly, having Andretti is going to build way more than what they currently have in terms of Haas and Logan Sargent. Because, like you said, Haas is mainly Italian at this point. It's the only thing that you can really get behind is like, oh, I guess the Haas name is also in NASCAR, so that's cool. I guess that's there's a little connection there. And Logan Sargent, I guess his brother also competed in NASCAR, mostly in the truck series. So that's also, I guess, another little connection, plus the fact that he is American as a driver from Florida. But I just don't think that either of those have enough of a build-up behind it that you would get from having Andretti themselves come in and be that team, be that American team that everyone can rally behind, that has, well, American drivers, like having people like Colton Herta and other drivers along those lines to join the ranks and really start to have something that Americans can rally behind. Because that's the one thing that F1 is really, really missing in terms of the American market. They're missing someone that they can all rally behind completely.
I mean,
Yeah,
pretty
and then
much.
and then also the current Concord agreement allows up to 12 teams, which, mind you not, these are the same teams that rejected Andretti agreed with this Concord agreement a year and a half ago. I think 2 years ago, the current Concord agreement is being established. So it's like they say, yeah, we'll allow up to 12 teams, but don't don't think we're actually gonna commit to that part of the deal. We just want to make it look more appealing to like commercial interest and all that. And then I think JT said it way earlier in the show. A lot of these teams, a lot of these tracks in which F1 said is going to be a burden to add just one additional team. These are the same tracks that host endurance championships, in which you see up to 37 right now, I think this year they're going to have 37 cars full time in the World Endurance Championship with no issue whatsoever. But yet, adding an 11th team is what crimes against humanity for them, because the poor track workers can't handle an 11th team, but they can handle a 37 odd number cars. It's ridiculous, honestly.
The
Yeah,
only track that I could see it possibly being an issue is Monaco, and that's honestly because Monaco has been an issue for a while, honestly. Because I mean, part of that is not even really so much of an 11th team issue or an additional team. The problem is that just the current F1 cars are just too big for the track, so it's like it's just basically a parade around the streets of Monaco, and people like it or whatever just because the prestige and it looks aesthetically pleasing to see the cars on the street, but that's about it. I'm talking about Logan Sargent. I mean, the main problem of why nobody gels with Logan Sargent is because nobody who knows who he is. Most American race fans really don't know who he is. And that's why it's not working. That's why the whole I mean, yeah, I've seen plenty of the memes. There's plenty of the memes of, what the fuck is a kilometer and, all that stuff. But it's like, I mean, who is Logan Sargent? People just don't know who he is. And honestly, I really don't think there's anything too special about him. I mean, to be honest, it's like, I don't know. He doesn't have like that charisma or whatever that makes me like want to support him. Like, I don't know. Other than like most people probably support him just for that bit of what the fuck is a kilometer. Not really because, he's like, I don't know, memorable or like a driver that people like really rally behind.
Yeah, and I definitely think you're certainly onto something there. To be fair, he seems like a nice enough young man. Certainly with his personness, I don't really have any particular issues there, but he's not a particularly memorable character, at least not right now. Granted, the same thing could be levied against Piastri as well, but that's a different podcast for a different day. But also, the big thing is you particularly, Brocky, you had mentioned the current Concord agreement. Well, it's also worth noting that even within the FIA, the current maximum field size is 27 cars. So you could actually go one more than even what the Concord agreement allows. And, you talk about, too many cars and things. Think about the early 90s in the days of pre-qualifying where I think, oh, goodness me, was it 93 or 94 where I think there were like 30 cars, 30 plus vying for. Now, of course, yes, because of the way it was set up, not all of those cars made the grid. That was the point of pre-qualifying, so on and so forth. But yes, it's like when F1 was far less a, well-oiled sporting and commercial machine like it is now. I mean, truth be told, it was kind of like the Wild West in the early 90s. They figured it out. It was Friday was pre-qualifying, let the new teams with the slow, crappy cars go and basically clean the track and had to have a chance at, filling out those last few spots on the grid. And then do proper quali on Saturday, and then race on Sunday. It's like we've been down this road before. And now, don't get me wrong, as funny as it is to talk about, 40, MasterCard Lola, Simtech Pacific, Scuderia Italia, Coloni, just to name kind of a handful of the kind of, plucky chancers from that era. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't all good because those cars were often slow, miserable death traps. But, like I said, they figured it out. So there's no reason, especially given the vast array of, safety and timing and what have you that we have now, there's absolutely no reason why additional cars at these tracks, certainly there's no reason why it couldn't work other than effectively greed. And to be fair, I mean, we've all seen the reactions on socials, and not even just from American race fans, F1 fans, but just globally. Everybody thinks that this is complete nonsense. To deny it, I haven't seen a media, particularly an F1 based media outlet yet, go, actually, you know what? That was a good idea. You talk about how fragmented, particularly Formula One fandoms are at the moment. And yet, I think everybody came together to go, you're stupid.
Essentially.
Pretty much. And mind you not, F1 does allow an 11th team, but for a movie. We all saw
Exactly.
that. We all saw Silverstone. We all everyone here saw Silverstone. They had enough. They had enough space to
With
squeeze in
APX
two extra
GP.
cars. Yeah.
My thing
So
is that even then, literally, if you go back only a few years to 2014, we had 11 teams on the grid at that point. The teams that we had on the grid, Caterham, Scuderia Ferrari, Force India, Lotus, Marussia, McLaren, Mercedes, Red Bull, Sauber, Toro Rosso, and Williams. We had 11 teams at one point. But what changed in between that time, I guess, other than the fact that because you had, Caterham and Lotus come, or Caterham, Lotus, and Marussia come in, and they were all quite off the pace, which is understandable. But I don't think that what happened in 2014 and those years should have been a reason or should play any part into trying to say Andretti shouldn't be allowed in because they're actually a team that's worth honestly at this point near billions. They're worth quite a lot with a lot of pull to them. And I think that that alone was something that they should have been able to bring in. They bring in value to F1. Even if F1 doesn't think that, they most definitely do bring in that value with a lot of American money coming behind it. So that's why I'm just like it doesn't make a ton of sense to me to the fact that they would just decide, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to let you in, even though, your application was accepted.
Yeah, and the big thing is, and it's worth noting, because you shouted out basically the 2010 era, when there was the big push for the teams. Part of the reason why all those teams failed is because they were all attracted to F1 on the premise, ironically, of a budget cap that then the existing teams very roundly shot down. So you had teams that really couldn't afford the spend of F1 that were then suddenly thrust into F1 regardless. The reason, all of those teams, because I mean, well, actually, out of those teams, because out of the proposed teams, it was ProDrive, USF1, which Haas and kind of inadvertently rose from the ashes of HRT, the Spaniard racing team, and oh my goodness, I think it was Lotus. It was the one because it flip flopped between Lotus and Caterham a handful of times before it dissolved, and then Renault came back. I can't remember exactly how that went, but point is that there were a handful of different teams, and Lotus was the only one to make the grid, and then Marussia popped up a few years later. Like, yes, the very real, definitely legitimate Russian supercar company that definitely built cars, even though nobody, I think, to this day, I don't know if they ever actually ended up producing any. I know a
The
few.
only, I was gonna say, the only time you ever saw Marussia was, well, they actually did pop up in one game, and that was Need for Speed Most Wanted 2012.
Mm-hmm.
That was the only game that I can vividly remember that car showing up in, but I can't remember any times that car has been on the road tests, anything of the sorts.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I was actually just about to say that was Need for Speed, and actually it was in a couple of asphalt games too. But otherwise, I'm like, okay. But those somehow add value to the sport. But yes, one of the biggest motorsports brands on the planets. I mean, it's worth noting, Andretti, we certainly, all of us, I think a lot of us think, IndyCar, but I mean, they're in Extreme E, they're in Formula E at the moment. Of course, they're in, the NTT IndyCar Championship. They're doing endurance racing in IMSA.
Not to mention the fact that they also have a little bit of pull on the Australians too, with Walkinshaw and Andretti United.
Mm-hmm.
They have a little bit of pull there that they could easily use to bring, well, what is two quite similar fan bases, Americans and Australians.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of pull behind that. So I think that if you really think about it, there's not a lot of sense towards getting or not allowing them in unless it's really just the FIA and the teams themselves being a bit greedy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really what it boils down to. Now part of the statement, like I said, if you're curious, you can certainly go and read it. There was a little bit of chatter that some of the competitive argument not only was based around, the customer thing, which is worth noting was actually only going to be a stopgap initially until it got pushed forward to 2026 because it took everybody so goddamn long. But was also, from what I understand, it was alleged that the FOM may have had a look at some of Andretti's other exploits at the moment in other categories. And actually, JT, we've talked about it. Andretti kind of figuring out what on earth it's doing in IndyCar. It's, very setup dependent, very circuit dependent, and also having a bunch of drivers in its arsenal that go hot and cold kind of at the drop of a hat don't really help it either. But it's worth noting that Andretti shares the grid with some teams that are currently in the F1 championship. And last I checked, Andretti was kicking McLaren's ass up and down Formula E quite thoroughly. And actually, ditto Extreme E. Granted, season 4 has actually just got underway of Extreme E, so we'll have to see how that goes. But McLaren didn't exactly do all that well there either. So, you look at other categories, and even then, that still doesn't make sense. And before I pivot and have somebody let the floor, I would like to point out the hypocrisy of FOM being upset about effectively the rebadged Renault power unit when Ford is doing the exact same thing with Red Bull at the moment. It's a Honda engine, essentially. That's just a branding deal until Ford can build their own power unit for 2026. Like, come on now.
They do as I say, not as I do type thing, and it is like pretty much FOM are walking contradictions. They're allowing Alpine and Red Bull to rebrand their engines, but God forbid, Andretti just comes in with a partnership with Renault for at least a season or two, and then have a deal with and have GM so now be their sole engine supplier. It's just it's a whole lot of nonsense coming from them.
I think that it's just a whole lot of nonsense, but it's a whole lot of preference towards the existing teams. The teams that they've already had there for a long while, of course they're just going to give them, the max that they can. Basically, like, they're going to get a lot of preference on a lot of things towards a team that's trying to come in and do the same. And I think that having that sort of preference is really what's going to shoot, like, another big thing that's going to shoot them in the end. Because, I mean, I get that you want to keep those teams. I don't think that you having that preference over them would make them leave. But I think that, like, just having a team like Andretti use Renault power units for 1 year and then switch over to, solely GM units, that's not a bad thing. Many teams have done that before. There's a ton of teams that hopped in the sport and basically just said, okay, we're going to use this power unit until we're able to bring in our own manufacturer. It's happened before. Like, I think a few examples are the multiple times that BMW has came in to sponsor and be on a team, like Sauber and Williams. It's happened before. So that's why I think it's just really, really odd and quite nonsensical that they're just doing that, essentially. Just having that preference towards the already established teams like that.
Yeah, and way back in the day, it was also BMW Brabham, because that was that crazy four-cylinder that made 60 pounds of boost and apparently made like 1,300 horsepower in qualifying trim, if the legend is to be believed. Um, but yeah, I mean, and that's like I said, it is. It's preferential treatment, and the thing is, we've seen it time and time again. The FIA has played chicken with the teams and ultimately won. Because like I said, the teams, pitch a fit, like, oh, we won't like this, we'll break away, blah, blah, yada, yada. And then, like I said, there was so much wrong with Max Mosley. I could spend so much time talking about the dumpster fire that particularly the last about 15 years of his tenure was. But the one thing that he always did was call the teams on their bluff, and he always won. Um, so there was really even though, yes, the teams do have more power now, there was still really no need to effectively capitulate, because that was what happened to their lack of desire to have an additional team. It's like you talk about having some of the best facilities, best engineering, best drivers, that you'll find anywhere at any time. Then okay, then go beat up on Andretti and show him who's boss. Then, if that's the case, as opposed to sitting here and just being like, no, we can't have an extra team, and sit and basically cry about it, until you get your way. Yeah, like I said, this is, you know, one thing, I guess, thank the high heavens that, we had the Lewis to Mercedes stuff to pretty effectively distract, because if there had been a little bit more time to marinate on this, there was the potential for the sport to look exceptionally stupid. Although, truth be told, A, that's already happened, and B, we'll see, because Andretti is, clearly not happy. I'm a little surprised that GM has been very, very mum throughout all of this. I'd be interested to know quite what that's about.
I,
Um,
I would believe that they're probably, I guess, trying to keep that whole side in the shadows while more promoting their stuff with IMSA and Pratt and Miller. That'll be my guess. But
yeah, you could potentially be onto something. I don't know. I'll have to poke my GM employee friend about that and see what she thinks. But yeah, but like I said, just a absolute monster in the F1 news cycle, between particularly the Andretti bid ostensibly failing for now, and then Lewis making the jump to Ferrari. This has been probably the busiest news cycle that we've had in the sport in the better part of a decade, arguably more so. So, just, I don't know if anything, it's going to be a while, I think, before anything tops the last, about 60 odd hours. But I do want to thank everybody so much for listening. It was a great fun to sit down and record this. And of course, thank you so much to Caleb and to Baraka for gracing us with their presence. But until next time, this has been Chicanery. Thank you so much.